Hi there. Thanks for joining us in this talk about enterprise data protection. So if you have an application that needs to be trusted by an enterprise or that handles work and personal data, then this talk is really for you. Hi, I'm Derek Adam. I'm here with Rohit Gowda.
Hi.
And in a few minutes, Rohit's going to show us how easy it is to set up our Visual Studio environment to consume WinRT APIs, like the ones for EDP, whether it's in an unmanaged C++ project or for a universal app. But before we get to that, I'm going to cover how the expectations for a work app have really changed with the advent of enterprise data protection, or EDP. Now, this is really an extension of a talk that I did last year at Build 2015. If you haven't seen that talk, I encourage you to go back, get some more context, but just to do a quick recap, it lets an enterprise admin send policy through MDM, mobile device management, to a desktop or a phone to do 5 things. First, it restricts access to enterprise data to only those applications that the IT pro trusts. Second, it sets the network boundary for what constitutes enterprise data. So the intranet, optionally the VPN that's triggered to get to the intranet, and any cloud resources that belong to the enterprise. Third, it sets the clipboard enforcement level. So when enterprise data is present, it can be blocked from going into a personal context. Or they can say, set the policy to allow a user to override with an audit. And this applies to the clipboard, the share contract, and the drag-drop engine in Windows. Fourth, there's an additional policy for data protection under lock on Windows phones. So what this does is when the screen is locked, Windows throws away the decryption key needed for enterprise data. And this really protects a device that's lost from attacks even at the system level or from a driver. And all of these things are brought together to enable selective wipe. So when the device is unenrolled from management, we securely wipe the key, and all of that enterprise data is no longer available. So about now, you're probably wondering, OK, what does this have to do with me? Why would I have to enlighten my application? Well, remember, thing one was the admin can decide whether your application is allowed to access enterprise data. So you have to convince him that it's actually trustworthy. You need to handle, if you handle both work and personal data in your application, you simply must enlighten your app. Why is that? Well, an unenlightened application, Windows detects, and then any data that it writes to disk is automatically encrypted. If you're handling any personal data, what that really means is that you're taking that person's data away and throwing it away when the device is revoked. IT pros cannot afford to treat their users that badly, and so your application wouldn't be trusted. Another reason is, even if you're only handling enterprise data, you still have to handle revoke gracefully. So if you have an unenlightened application and all of your files are being encrypted, if any of those files are needed for your application to boot or to power one of the features of your application, you've got a broken app. So at the very least, you need to test your application with EDP and after revoke so that you can make a support statement for your application. And lastly, this is really for Windows Phone applications right now, but you need to code for data protection under lock so that when the data stops being available at any time, you can react to that event, and then when the data is available again because the user is present, you can have a fresh experience. But I really think that the most important reason is this first one, to handle both work and personal data. And I think it's easier for us to wrap our head around this if we can see an enlightened application. So I'm going to run through a few and then talk through the APIs that are used so that your application can do the same thing. So here I have a desktop that's been provisioned with enterprise data protection policy because I've enrolled in device management. And we can see in the Start menu that some of my applications have gotten decorated with this glyph that indicates it's allowed to access enterprise data. These aren't necessarily the final visuals. We're still working through that. But for now, you can see all of the applications that are allowed to access data get this glyph. And the ones that are not, do not. In the application list, we get instead this managed icon. Those are the only applications that are allowed to access enterprise data. Well, it's great. Now I have policy. Where's all this enterprise data I'm supposed to be protecting? It can come from a few places, but one common place is through a file sync engine, like OneDrive for Business. Now, OneDrive for Business is actually a converged sync engine. It supports handling both work and personal data. And here you can see, in my OneDrive for Business, my Microsoft's account, it's encrypted to my enterprise. And my personal data is not, because no policy applies to my personal data. Dropbox does the same thing. Dropbox for Business encrypts all of my work data to my enterprise, and my personal data is left alone. So how did they do that? Well, there's a couple of ways. One is to check the endpoint for the server that you're attaching to. If it's enterprise owned, then you need to protect all the data that comes from it. And you can do that with Get Primary Managed Identity for Network Endpoint Async. It's a mouthful, but it does exactly what it says. It gives you the identity of the endpoint, and you can use that in the protect async call to protect all of the files. But these applications are not just protecting data so it can be revoked. These apps are enlightened so that they also guard the boundary between work and personal. So if, for example, I take this encrypted file and I make a copy of it, can I put it into my Dropbox for personal purposes? Here we can see that the paste is going through. The encrypted file is copied on the local system, but it retained protection. So this file can still be revoked. But then when we see that the sync has been analyzed, we'll see that, I'll even zoom in so that this is a little easier to see. But this was not able to sync. And that's because this data does not belong to the personal account. So, all right, I tried it there. What if I try to move it to my OneDrive personal? Again, move the file, protection was persisted, but I see that I have a sync error. And when I go and look at it, I find that one of the files couldn't be synchronized because we can't sync this file. It is protected to a different account. Sync engines aren't the only way that enterprise data comes down, though. If I go into a browser, the browsers that are built into Windows, Edge, and Internet Explorer have both been enlightened for EDP. And we can see that a website is managed by my company. But if I go to OneDrive Personal, it's not. It doesn't get that treatment. And any data that I copy down from this enterprise site will be protected when I download it. When I open this folder, you can see that it was encrypted and it gets marked as enterprise data. The same thing happens in Dropbox. So here we are in Dropbox for Business. What happens if I pull down this secret formula for success? It gets pulled down and encrypted on download. And we can see that it opens in enterprise mode. This app is managed by my enterprise. And if I copy some data from this application and then try to move it into a personal context, say I've got my cookie recipe, and paste. Here we can see that the policy was applied, and I'm unable to move this without getting an audit, because that's the policy that was set for my machine. So I'm going to not do that. that's something actually I kind of skipped over, didn't I? Let's have a look at this again. When I downloaded this file, it was put into enterprise mode. How did they do that? Well, when the file was downloaded, it was encrypted. When the file was opened, they can inspect that with get protection info async. That tells it that it's an enterprise file and also tells it which enterprise owns that file. Then they have to move into enterprise mode. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. One is to apply it to your entire process. If you are a Win32 application, you can call try apply process UI policy, and that will cause Windows to enforce all of those UI restrictions like the clipboard and drag drop. Another way to do this is by window. So you can, in a universal application, use get for current view to get the data, the protection policy manager object, and set the enterprise ID that way. In a desktop application, you can call protection policy manager with your hwind, your window handle, and that will cause enforcement to occur on that window. Now, I did show you this Word mobile application is enlightened. In fact, all of the mobile applications for Office that are already in the store are enlightened for EDP. And we can also see that we get the same experience on a Windows phone. Here we can see that the tiles are decorated for all of the applications that are allowed to access enterprise data. If I go to File Explorer, I can see files that are encrypted. And you can even see that this is on the SD card. So the FAT and exFAT file systems now support file encryption. If I open this photo of my exit strategy, this is work data, and I attempt to share it to, say, an unenlightened application, I get the same experience as I would on Windows desktop. The enforcements for desktop files work the same as on the phone. So if I go to, say, some documents, and some of them are encrypted, I will. Here we can see that some of my files are encrypted and some of them are not. If I go to that super secret formula that I have for success and copy out my secret ingredient, and then go back to a personal document, this is the same application, but using a different context, different data. And if I attempt to paste now, I get the same dialogue. So I prevented perspiration from leaking into this grandma cookie recipe. No sweat there. Now, something I didn't get to show you last year was some of the Office 2016 suite applications and how they've been enlightened. Now, I don't need to go through all of them. They work pretty much the same as the mobile applications, but there is something I can show you in Outlook that's a little different and may apply to your application. Here you can see I have some work data. This is my work email account, and I have a personal account. What happens if I try to take that work data and put it into my personal email? Right away, we can see that I get this prompt, the same policy applied, and I haven't even left the same window. How did we do that? There's a new interface called iEnterprise Drop Target, which will let you evaluate policy even within the same window. So I hope that gives you a sense of how the expectations for a work app have changed. And I think it's time to see how we can build our environment to start using the same APIs. So Rohit, can you help us see that?
Thank you, Derek. Before you can start using Windows Runtime APIs in your unmanaged C++ application or your universal Windows application, there are a few changes you need to make in your project. Let's begin by understanding the changes you need to make in your unmanaged C++ application. In order to ensure that your C++ application can consume Windows Runtime extensions, you need to set a compiler flag called ZW. And to set this flag in Visual Studio, you go to project properties, and then under C general section, you will find an option to set the compiler flag ZW to S. Once this compiler flag is set, all the Windows runtime objects will be automatically ref counted. And also, when the ref count reaches 0, the objects will be discarded automatically. The incremental linker does not allow adding Windows metadata to the .object files. Hence, you need to disable minimum rebuild in your C++ project. You can do this simply by going to project properties in your Visual Studio, C++, and code generation, and then setting the flag, compiler flag GM to no. Disabling the minimum rebuild may slightly increase the build time of your application. And this is because whenever the class definitions in your .h file changes, the .cpp files have to be recompiled. So that's it. These are the two small changes you need to make to your compiler flags in order to start your application for enlightenment. Now, the Windows runtime interface is a COM-based interface. When your application depends on a COM-based interface, you need to ensure that the main function is decorated with a attribute that indicates the threading apartment model. So in your application, if your application is using single threaded apartment model, you need to add an attribute called platform : STA thread. And if your application is using multi-threaded apartment model, you need to add an attribute platform : MTA thread. And lastly, you also need to the C++ application need to indicate to the Windows operating system that it is EDP enlightened. And you can simply do this by opening the resource file and adding a flag called Microsoft EDP enlightened appinfo and setting that flag to value 1. And also you need to specify the EDP enlightened appinfo ID, which is the type of the flag. So that's it. Your application can now consume Windows runtime APIs. Although your application can consume Windows runtime APIs directly in a C++ application, it is recommended you use the task class that's defined in parallel patterns library. A very common pattern with asynchronous programming model is to define a series of operations, and this is called task chaining. In your task class, there is a method called then that allows task chaining by allowing continuation between two different tasks. So in this example that I'm showing you, we have two asynchronous Windows runtime APIs. One is called get file for path async, and the other one is called protect async. The get file from path async takes a string as input. The string is the path for the file, and the protect async takes the storage file object and also a string which is the enterprise identity. Now, what we are doing here in this example is we are wrapping the asynchronous API get file from path async inside a task object, and the output of this task object is provided as an input to the next task, which is wrapping the protect async API. Now, the output of the first task is the storage file object, and we are providing that as input to the next task, which is wrapping the protect async API. So this is a very simple pattern that you can follow to use C++, to use Windows Runtime API in your C++ application. Now, these are the small changes you need to do to your unmanaged C++ application in order to get it ready for enlightenment for EDP. Now, let's take a look at the changes you need to make to a universal Windows application to enlighten it for EDP. Now, the changes that you need to make in a universal Windows application are very simple. First, when you create a blank universal application, you need to add, by default, there is a capability called Internet Client already present in the application manifest. This capability will give the application access to the Internet. Next, you need to add another capability called Private Network Client Server, which is also needs to be added to the application manifest. And this capability will give your application access to the private network at work. And lastly, you also need to add another capability called Enterprise Data Policy. And this capability will indicate to the Windows operating system that the application, the universal Windows application, is enlightened for enterprise data protection. This capability is a restricted capability. So this means that you need to have an exception in file for the universal Windows application before you can submit the application for Windows Store certification. So apart from the capability, you also need to add a namespace rescap to the package node in the application manifest. And the rescap is defining the schemas for the restricted capabilities. Lastly, you also need to add the rescap namespace to the ignorable namespace node. This is because if your application is running on a Windows operating system version that doesn't support restricted capabilities, the namespace restricted capability will be ignored. So that's it. These are the simple changes you need to make to your universal Windows application to get it ready for enlightening for enterprise data protection. Thanks for listening. Happy programming, and back to Derek.
Thanks, Rohit. So to be able to enjoy these features of enterprise data protection, you'll need to send the policies down. And for this, you can easily get an Intune account. I'll leave a link in the resources for how to get there. And I'm not going to go through the general policies for setting up users and groups and that sort of thing. But I think it would help to know where this enterprise data policy is. It's a configuration policy, and you can add a new policy to make it. You go to Windows, and then Enterprise Data Protection for Windows 10 Desktop and Mobile and later. So if I do this, you'll create a policy, and it will look something like this. For the sake of time, I'm going to just show you one that I've already configured. A protected app, there are really two kinds of ways of easily setting this up for your test environment. You can set up a universal app with I'll go through some Microsoft applications so that you can see what the publisher name would be. And for a universal app, this is what the product name looks like. So here I've set up Edge. The Office applications that come from the store are very similar. They would have the name Microsoft Office followed by the name like Excel, OneNote. Here we have Word. For photos, it would be Microsoft Windows Photos, etc. For desktop applications, there are some inbox applications that can be put on the list immediately. So for it, you choose desktop application. The publisher would be Microsoft. You can leave the product name as a star, and then for the file name, give what the file name is for the application. In this case, I've got Internet Explorer. You could also add, say, Notepad or Paint, and that should be enough to get you started downloading and setting up the policy. You have to set a clipboard enforcement level. I recommend that you make it override, because then you get to see more of the actual interactions with the user. Next is this primary domain. This is actually not very well named. We've taken some feedback about this. But it's the list of domains that are managed identities. And the first one is your primary identity for the enterprise. Anything after that, if there's a user at this domain, that account will be treated as managed, and it would be managed by the first item, say Microsoft.com. Some minimal policy for your network configuration are to add network domain names and IP address ranges. They're both needed because an IP address range can be reused. You might be using 192.168.something, which is commonly used in home routers, but it can also be used at work. The network isolation layer checks to see if it's bound to a domain name that's in this list before deciding that that is an enterprise endpoint. Proxy servers are optional, but if you set one, you'll need to set both the internal addresses that your intranet sees as well as the proxies that are seen from the outside. And if you want to set up cloud resources, soon you won't need to have internal proxies configured for this. For now, you do. By the time build comes out, hopefully this won't be needed. And so you set it up as the domain that you want to manage for enterprise, followed by the proxy. And you can have a list of these separated by a pipe. So here are some resources for you to check out. There's the build talk that I gave last year that gives a little bit more background, and you can see a longer list of the APIs. You can go straight to the APIs themselves on MSDN. We have samples on GitHub, and you should look for the enterprise data protection samples. And finally, go and get an Intune trial so that you can set your policy up like I just did. That's it. Thanks a lot for joining us in this talk about enterprise data protection, and have a lot of fun setting up your apps for work.
Thank you.